Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, your co-host and PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications. This week, we have a great conversation with Susan Crabtree, who's a correspondent for RealClearPolitics, formerly senior writer for the Washington Free Beacon and White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner. You see her all the time on Fox and the various TV networks. And she's also an award-winning journalist who won the Dow Prize from the National Journalism Center in 2024 for her investigation of the U.S. Secret Service after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And this week we talk with Susan about her terrific new book on Gavin Newsom called Fool's Gold: The Radicals, Con Artists, and Traitors Who Killed the California Dream and Now Threaten Us All. And, as someone who's written my own version of this book, in the California Left Coast Survivors Guide, I really enjoyed reading the book and how she goes into the individuals and the policy prescriptions that really have transformed California for the negative into a place with a high cost of living, low quality of life, little liberty and opportunity for most Californians. So we talk with Susan about all things Gavin Newsom. We get her thoughts on the national scene too, including what she thinks about that hot book by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson called Original Sin on the cover-up of Joe Biden's diminished mental capacity. So I think you'll all enjoy this episode very much, so stay tuned, and after the break, we'll have our conversation with Susan Crabtree. We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates, so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. Susan, thank you for joining us on Next Round.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great to be with you.
Well, it's really great to have you on to discuss your terrific book on Gavin Newsom, Fool's Gold, which is available at wherever you like to buy books. And, as we were saying before we started, I feel a great kinship with fellow authors who are writing about Gavin Newsom. And, kind of in the vein of my book, the California Left Coast Survivors Guide, your book also portrays California as a really cautionary tale for the nation. So now that, thinking back on all the work that you've done and what you have written in the book, what one or two key decisions or policies stands out for you as having most significantly contributed to the state's current challenges?
Well, thank you so much again for having me. I think that as authors, people trying to hold the state accountable and the state's officials accountable, we need to stick together, and I'm so thankful for this opportunity. When you're talking about of course, the main problems in California, there's three big ones. You've got the very obvious ones, the homelessness problem, the crime problem, and the cost of living issue. And the cost of living has many causes, but the homelessness and the crime, you can trace that right back directly to the progressive vision from Gavin Newsom, the governor, and on down to everyone in the supermajority controlled legislature, the Democratic leadership in the legislature. So the crime issue, in particular, we go into heavily in the book, that it stems from Proposition 47. It was something that George Gascon Braun, who was very close to Gavin Newsom throughout his career, was the LA district attorney who was, there was attempted recalls against him twice. Finally, the people spoke quite convincingly last November and swept him out of office. He was the author of that Proposition 47 that lowered felonies to misdemeanors, and especially when it came to crimes and theft, the threshold was now, if it was under $900, it was no longer a felony. So that led to all of those wonderful smash and grabs that we saw across the state, with masked robbers running into Nordstrom's and even drugstores, so that now we have to put everything behind lock and key in California. That was a huge mistake, and Gavin Newsom was the top elected official that came out first to support Proposition 47. Even Jerry Brown, who was governor at the time in 2014, was more quiet than Gavin Newsom was himself. He was aggressively supporting that, and he aggressively supported emptying out the prisons. The Supreme Court, and I believe it was in 2010, they ruled that prisons were overcrowded in California, and the state needed to do something about it. Of course, the Democrats could have, and Gavin Newsom could have responded to that by building more prisons, but that's not what they did. They increased the ability they eased the parole system with Prop 57, and they started emptying out the prisons. The biggest concern I saw with that was during COVID, when Gavin Newsom, and we find that out in the book. We have a whistleblower come to us in the book talking about what the false pretenses that Gavin Newsom emptied the prisons during COVID under false pretenses. He told the public that he wanted to do so because he thought there would be a death spiral in the prisons, just like the nursing homes that we saw across the country. But that was not the case. He let, I believe, tens of thousands. I'm hearing 15,000 now from new reports. But there was, from the start of Gavin Newsom's tenure to today, there's been 70,000 prisoners released. And we wonder why that has corresponded with an increase in violent crime in California, and crime of all type. California has 31% above the national average in crime statistics, and an increase of 15% since Gavin Newsom has been in office. So we can talk about homelessness too, but certainly the crime is the focus of the book. And there's two propositions that you can just directly tie the problem to.
So with Gavin Newsom, he's kind of as they call it, a target-rich environment. He's always doing something new. He's got his fact-checking websites. He's got his upcoming book tour. He's got his many out-of-state and sometimes out-of-country campaign stops, or as he would call them, fact-finding missions. You know, he took his kids on spring break to a civil rights museum in Alabama, also so he could attend fundraisers and run campaign ads. You know, certainly we in California have a front row seat to this, as we document in the California Left Close Survivor Guide. You know, it seems like Newsom is more interested in creating vibes and feels than he's actually interested in accomplishing anything. In Fool's Gold, you describe Newsom's leadership as performative rather than substantive. Can you elaborate on any specific instances, or maybe just your top few, since I'm sure your mind is overflowing with examples, but can you elaborate on a few instances where his actions did not align with his rhetoric?
Absolutely. So I have said many times that this podcast, trying to run for president via podcast, does not surprise me whatsoever, because as we outline in the book, it's everything from how he got into college, on another false pretenses. We called it Field of Schemes. He says that he had this wonderful baseball scholarship, which we break down, and it falls apart. That he was never really on the real varsity team at Santa Clara University, and we can go into that. It's a fun story. And he doesn't mention that Jerry Brown, the former governor, a recommendation accompanied his application, and it was all basically that his father's friends in San Francisco helped get him to the popular Santa Clara University, which is in now Silicon Valley, very popular for that area. That's performative. He didn't have the SATs and he didn't have the grades to get into that university. So he says he got in via a baseball scholarship. That's absolutely not true. We go into it in great detail. I talked to his former coach. So then then it goes to his wine, the source of all of his wealth, his wine business, the Plumpjack wine. He got that through getting money, so he didn't earn that himself. So that he thinks he can just use rhetoric and all these lovely flourishes, rhetorical flourishes, and press conferences and podcasts to sort of burnish his record, which is just a failing record in California. But mostly, I would like to zero in on the homelessness issue. Homelessness has been something that Gavin Newsom has talked about for decades. When he was San Francisco mayor, he talked about he was going to solve San Francisco's homeless problem, but he had the wrong solution. It was always housing first, throw money at the problem and try to go with the popular phrase at the time and the popular mantra from progressives that you have to build more housing, and then suddenly it will magically address all of the addiction problems and the mental health issues that we see and the fentanyl zombies that we see in the streets of LA and San Francisco and throughout the state. But that never was the right solution. We have had $24 billion, as you all know, more than that now, spent on homelessness, and it's increased. Homelessness has only increased. So the problem is getting worse. And now we see Gavin Newsom actually blaming the states and counties for not sweeping up the encampments. Just a few years ago, he was against getting rid of these encampments, and he thought it was inhumane to do so. And now he has a great deflection with blaming the counties and the cities for not cleaning up these encampments because there was a Supreme Court ruling for a case in Grants Pass, Oregon, that the judge finally said, yes, you can go ahead and do that. The cities can go ahead and clean up these encampments and bar people from using public streets to camp out. And Gavin Newsom, all of a sudden, he's embracing that that decision, but it cannot reverse decades of his housing first that enabled these, basically attracted homeless from across the country and enabled their drug addictions and allowed them to have these mental health problems on the streets. We can go into all of those issues as he created during COVID. He wanted to turn these motels into homeless across the state into homeless housing, and it just didn't work, because if you're not addressing the mental health issues and the addiction issues, it just becomes a hellscape. These houses, the LA Times actually did a very good story on one of them. They're hotel that they spent millions refurbishing. They allowed homeless to live in these hotels, and there were rats, there was trash strewn everywhere, there was even feces strewn on one of the walls. Drugs people were lighting up in not just their rooms, but in the back stairwells. It was an extreme problem, and for the neighborhood itself, no one in the neighborhood liked it. They had to end up shutting it down because it became so unsanitary and basically just a horrible place for the neighborhood. And now, and then Karen Bass actually wanted to throw more money into the mayor of LA, wanted to throw more money into that, and the neighborhood has been fighting that. So these situations don't work unless you have real solutions. He's starting to talk about that with his care courts, but you cannot reverse decades of bad policies in 2 years as he has his eye in the White House.
As a Santa Clara grad, I particularly love the Santa Clara baseball story, and everything. It's unbelievable that even starting at that young age, he would go to all those lengths. But I guess we should not be surprised, knowing who we've come to know over his time in elective office. So PRI, of course, has written a lot about how years of all these bad policies that we're talking about here, and also inaction by state officials and lack of results from officials like Governor Newsom have led to tragedies like that tremendous wildfire that destroyed the town of Paradise and the devastating Southern California wildfires that we experienced this year. In your book, you detail Newsom's relationship with PG&E, especially concerning the Camp Fire tragedy. So how do you interpret his actions in relation to how accountable the utility has been held for their role in contributing to these fires?
When I first came back to California from Washington, D.C., I am a native Californian. I grew up in a little town called Redlands in the Inland Empire in Southern California. I went to D.C. for 23 years. And then I had this pull to come back because California is a beautiful place. You have to try hard, as Ron DeSantis says in that debate against Newsom, to screw it up. But they have. And when I first came back, I loved the beautiful landscapes, the outdoors, the balanced life that people have here, the weather, of course, fabulous. But things started becoming extremely concerning to me when I went down. I saw the homelessness in San Diego, and stores boarded up there, no new revitalization because nobody wanted to go downtown San Diego because the homeless had taken it over and there was a hepatitis outbreak. And then the fires. The fires showed me that this was just sort of a third world mentality. The fires kept coming. I moved here in 2017, and I know that there were fires sporadically before that, but then it seemed like there was a wildfire season. Every year you had to brace for these wildfires. And Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris, they all talk about that they blame it on climate change. And that because of the brush that they don't get rid of, that the environmentalists have for years prevented adequate brush clearing, but because of climate change, it's just everything just goes up in smoke because it's so dry. Well, that is actually a fabrication. If you look at what is actually sparking these wildfires, it is the utilities. PG&E is a prime culprit. It was the Wall Street Journal who actually kept track of all these wildfires and found that over a 6-year period from in the mid 2014 to 2019, 2021, around then, there were more than 1,500 wildfires caused by utilities. And that was like one every day and a half. And the Paradise one leveled that town. And it was very similar to what happened in Palisades. But what we know about the one in Paradise, which is in Northern California, is we know it was caused by the utilities not maintaining their equipment, these big hooks that carry all this high voltage. And the hook broke in the high winds, and the voltage fell on the ground and sparked this terrible fire. And 84 people were killed. And afterwards, the Gavin Newsom and PG&E is one of those companies. They had a terrible gas leak explosion in San Bruno many years ago, and they have been not held to account time and time again. The judges in these cases, when they go to court, they try to stick it to the PG&E, but they never really managed to do what they said they are supposed to be doing. The court's rulings trying to get them to pay out to the victims, and also to clean up and maintain their equipment. There's nobody holding their feet to the fire, and certainly not the Democrats and Gavin Newsom. His party is unlike anything I've ever seen in another state. Is in bed with the PG&E. They have talked about the donations. There is over $200 million that all of the utilities have given to politicians across the state over the last 2 decades. And Gavin Newsom and his wife have taken $700,000 directly from PG&E. PG&E was so close to the Newsoms that they pay for her gender justice films. Jennifer Siebel Newsom has a side project, as you probably know, that she creates these documentary films promoting gender ideology, and they are bankrolled in part by PG&E. And then she actually uses those films and promotes them to other school districts across the country and takes a cut for them screening those films in schools across the country. But PG&E is so close to the Newsoms that they served as an associate producer on one of her films and allowed her to screen it in the PG&E headquarters in downtown San Francisco. So setting that aside, when all of these things happened, the Camp Fire and several other terrible fires back in the 2017, 2018, 2019, he'd just come into office, Gavin Newsom, and he decided he was going to stop taking donations, people were being so critical of PG&E at the time because of this killing of 84 people, the deadliest fire in California history, even including the Palisades fire. He stopped taking donations. Well, but that hasn't stopped him. They actually, most recently, fast forward to one of his signature, the deals advocating for more money for the homeless, the CARE Act, that was not the CARE Act, but it funded the CARE Act last January. They were still supporting him to the tune of $300,000 to back that ballot measure that barely passed. Interestingly enough, he worked to get them a sweetheart deal that saved them from bankruptcy and allowed the money to be set aside for these victims, created basically a fund for victims, and they were allowed to continue, that was based on PG&E stock, which if it goes down, the victims don't get paid out as much. It was all hashed out in his office and paid for by our taxpayer dollars to the tune of more than several millions, and he used the same firm that PG&E used for years, O'Melveny and Myers, that they had on their retainer. I can go on, but I like to refer to the relationship between PG&E and the utilities and Democrats across the state is best sort of encapsulated by this quote from Willie Brown. He told the New York Times a couple years ago that he's always been on a retainer after leaving office with PG&E, and he loves getting their calls because it always generates an invoice.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
That's a pretty great quote. One of the real tragedies of the Newsom administration has been the fentanyl epidemic. In your book, you link the fentanyl crisis to sanctuary policies and illegal immigration. How do you connect these elements? Why do you think the situation became particularly bad during Newsom's governorship? And, what reforms do you think would make a difference in getting the crisis under control? From a California perspective, obviously the federal government plays a role in enforcing, the border. But from California's perspective, what reforms do you think could be enacted that can make a difference?
Well, I think the biggest reform is happening already. The closing of the border that Donald Trump has been so aggressive about, and you don't have as much fentanyl coming across the border. But I was at the border in 2020, the last time, right before the election, where Donald Trump lost, and I work with the Border Patrol, and they were talking to me, briefing me. They had assets. They were able, because there were so few people coming across the border during COVID, because they had that return to Mexico policy, that if you did come across the border, they would move you right back, send you right back across. Yeah, the agreement with Mexico, that they could position, that Border Patrol could position their assets up the coast to prevent the drug smuggling. All that went away when Joe Biden came into office, and that border just became a flood. And that corresponded with lots of increase in fentanyl deaths across the country, and in San Francisco especially. As you know, there are fentanyl precursors that the Chinese bring into the cartels, and then the cartels move them up to San Francisco. That's pretty well documented. We work with Peter Schweitzer's group. My co-author is a top researcher for Peter Schweitzer. He details that in one of his last books. So we didn't want to tread on that territory too much, but we do know for a fact that there were Honduran drug dealers in San Francisco, and the sanctuary policies were preventing those drug dealers from being deported back to Honduras. It's such a phenomenon that London Breed was called out, the then mayor of San Francisco, for saying that these drug dealers were mainly Honduran. And then the San Francisco Chronicle actually did a great story and found out, they looked at all the arrest records and found out, in fact, they were from Honduras. And then there was a town in Honduras that a lot of these drug dealers came from. And it was so popular, San Francisco was so popular down there, that they were building these mini mansions by the standards there. And they were putting San Francisco, the Golden Gate emblems all over the mansions. And there was even Golden Gate tattoos on a lot of these drug dealers' necks. They were making so much money and sending it back to Honduras. And they couldn't get rid of these drug dealers whenever they would arrest one. They couldn't deport them, like I said. And even if they put them in jail in the United States, in California, there was one that would just pop up from Honduras and replace them almost immediately. So, this is just a sad fact of the drug crisis in San Francisco and other areas of California and across the country, that our sanctuary policies are preventing real reform, and these people are making a lot of money on people suffering in addiction.
You're a Californian and an author about California politics and a longtime chronicler of national politics. So you've had a really interesting perch to view the differences in how Gavin Newsom plays at home and nationally. So how do you think, in your view, he's received nationally versus in the state? And how do you think he's covered by the media differently in California versus Washington?
That's a good question. I've seen recent polls that the podcast is not going over too well in his home state of California. That Newsom there's recent polls have said his popularity is hovering around 42%. But he's not getting a lot of traction nationally either. I've seen polls that show him that he's only, among the contenders for president, he's only in the single digit range. I think people now are starting to resent the fact that he seems so focused on 2028 and the White House, and not governing the state of California when you have crime 31% above the national average, and homelessness. The problem is just spiraling out of control and not getting better, despite billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars spent on it, and then just 6 billion more. And obviously we have the budget problem that we haven't discussed yet, but that was created by his decision to expand insurance for illegal immigrants across the state, creating just a huge budget hole, billions of dollars. And he just completely blowing up his estimates of 2.5 billion that he thought that it would cost. Now it's at the $12 billion range for next year if he doesn't cut back. And he said he will finally, he's reversing that and getting all kinds of backlash among the progressives in his party, but that has very, very little choice. So I don't think these things play well on the national stage at all, but they have a very thin bench when it comes to 2028. And he is, they believe that last time around they had another California progressive with Kamala Harris who had that very money-fueled campaign. She had plenty of money, but she couldn't get any traction and has a terrible time with her communication skills. I feel like the National Democrats see an opening for Gavin Newsom because no matter what the policies are and how terrible he's run his state, he seems to be able to finesse and talk his way out of things, or at least be able to put out some flashy rhetoric. And it's all it is. It's very performative, but it seems like the Democrats are very desperate at this time. Of course, we're going to have, and they are also just sidelining people that could be extremely viable, like Josh Shapiro, over the fact that he's Jewish and his politics don't match the progressive side of the party. So they're in disarray. And so that gives Newsom an opening on the national stage. But the policies are what's going to kill him, and the failure in California. Things like the Ron DeSantis bringing up the poop map of San Francisco. It's a big joke line. It's a great joke line, but it also happens to be true. And it's a sad testament on where the state has gone in recent years.
Susan, so I know we've talked a lot about California, we've talked a lot about your book, but I'm sure that is just like every other DC reporter, the only thing you can think about at the moment is Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson's latest book highlighting the depth of former President Biden's mental decline and the media's inability to report on it. And of course, I'm just joking, but I'm joking that that's the only thing on your mind, but it is something that is dominating a lot of the discussion in DC. Obviously, it's getting a lot of traction publicly, but like behind the scenes and informal conversations that you have at the media cocktail parties, that kind of stuff, how is this book and its revelations being received? Because a lot of the people who I guess have been paying attention are people who, I don't know, noticed that he was obviously in decline and either didn't write about it or, I don't know, they didn't write about it. One thing I've noticed is Jake Tapper in particular seems to have a tough time getting past this issue in his interviews. Where he was one of the top people running interference and saying that this was just a conspiracy theory that, President Biden was actually sharp as a tack. So how is this playing behind the scenes, especially amongst your peers and you personally, as a reporter? Did you ever notice any signs of decline besides what you obviously would see on TV and ever try to write about it?
I think it's quite funny. I covered Joe Biden for decades in Congress. I would see him every day. He always had a light step. He always was a backslapping kind of jokester, very very energetic guy. And his politics were whatever you wanted them to be. He was the senator from a very corporate state, the headquarters of many corporations in Delaware. So he sort of had to be in the middle ground. But that's not what we saw when he was in the White House. And I also thought, they called him, when Trump started calling him Sleepy Joe, I really didn't understand that reference because, he'd been out of the Oval Office. Well, he'd been out of the White House, the vice presidency for a couple years. I remember when he was thinking about running against Hillary Clinton for the Democratic primary in 2016, but he was still suffering from the death of his son, Beau. And that time period, he had went really downhill. And when he emerged onto the stage to run for president, it was shocking to me that how unenergetic he was, how he had transformed into sort of this weaker candidate and unsure on his feet. And now he ran during COVID. He had the great excuse to do a basement campaign from Delaware during COVID. And that all seemed kind of shocking to me. I remember I wrote a piece saying that he was going to be, I expected him to be sort of this scrappy combatant. He was sort of octogenarian and 70-something-year-old going at it. He always like to say he was going to take Trump out behind the, back. I don't know what the statement for that is, the turn of phrase, but he was going to, basically get into a fight with him. And I thought that that's how it was going to go for this campaign. Instead, we saw a completely different Joe Biden. And it wasn't at that point, I was not a White House reporter. I had a colleague who focused on the White House. I was living in California and became a national reporter. So it's slightly different. And you have beats. You don't really want to step on your colleagues' toes. But anytime I was asked on Real Clear Politics podcast, I would tell by my bosses, by other interviewers, anyone who would ask me, I would exactly state that I felt like he was greatly diminished and was suffering from mental decline. And I made no bones about it. I don't think that helped me with getting my questions answered with this particular White House, because that White House under Joe Biden was they meted out retribution. They kept the access firmly held, and if you said anything negative, they tracked it. And I think that's how they got away with this, because there was a lot of pre-questions. A lot of journalists were submitting their questions to Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary, ahead of time, and so that she could have a better time, because she herself wasn't sure on her feet, and certainly the president was obviously they would give him notes on who to call from, and he would actually state it. It was an open secret that he was having these problems cognitively and physically, and the press wasn't doing their jobs. And it's the biggest cover up of my lifetime. But I don't think we're going to see anybody lose their jobs. I don't think we're going to see Jake Tapper or anyone suffer for their inability to provide, accept the right coverage of something that's so critical. I mean, the fact that he pardoned thousands of people, way more than any president in recent history. Did he know who he was pardoning? Did he know that he was breaking records with the amount of people that he was pardoning? Did he, he had the auto pen. I know a lot of people have talked about the auto pen. Did he know what the policies? Did he support letting in all of these criminals across the border that went on to harm people in horrendous ways? I'm not sure that it was definitely not the same Joe Biden that I saw when I covered him day to day in the Senate.
We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Weingarten tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted.
Obviously, because he's the president, his mental fitness is literally a matter of national security. But for those of us who have spent any time in Washington, he's certainly not the first longtime politician to go downhill. Susan, I know you and I overlapped a bit when I was a congressional reporter, and I remember at the time the appropriations chairman in the Senate, Thad Cochran. I don't want to diagnose him. I don't know what he had, but an armchair diagnosis would be something like Alzheimer's or something to that effect. I mean, he was mentally incompetent, and I say that with no glee or anything like that. I just don't know what other words you could describe.
Right.
But he was really, really obviously bad, in bad shape. And then but no one ever really talked about it. I remember it was just like a thing everyone knew, but no one really wrote about. And then I think that obviously once I left, Dianne Feinstein, the former senator of California, she declined, and I remember seeing a bit of that when I would interview her, but it wasn't certainly was not at the Cochran level, and certainly not at the level it grew to before she left office. And then also Mitch McConnell seems to be having some similar issues. I mean, I don't know. I know with the Thad Cochran one, it was just something everyone knew but didn't really talk about, and I guess I don't really know why. I can speak to my own sort of reasons why I never wrote about it. I guess I never really knew what to say, even though I guess I could have just said the truth. I don't know. I mean, what's your observation of that? Because it really is, obviously with Biden, it's a bigger deal because he's the president, but setting aside his office for a second, I mean, it's not uncommon for longtime politicians to age out of good mental health. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I have a question besides just kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're completely accurate on all of the congressional senators and otherwise, the people that you mentioned. There should be, we've talked a lot about this in my house. My dad was a pilot. You can't be a pilot when there's an age limit on that in the military. Same with a captain of a military ship, Navy ship. With politicians, because they're supported so much by staff, that you see glimpses of this during the hearings when they have to interact with the media, but they can be sequestered very easily from the media in Washington. And it's mainly staff work at that level. So I don't think it's right, but certainly when it becomes the commander in chief, that if he's just a figurehead, then why do we even have a president of the United States? And why do we use that title, commander in chief, if he has the nuclear codes? but it's really his chief of staff. Why don't we just run the country by committee then? So we do, as a country, want to have had, certainly the people said this about Reagan in his later years, but it wasn't so pronounced. And then, of course, we did know that Reagan had Alzheimer's, but it's for his first term, that wasn't a problem. He was still known as the great communicator. But this is someone who wanted a second term when we could see that he was already failing. And we know now that his whether you believe that he didn't have the prostate cancer beforehand or not, he has cancer now, and he was physically and mentally in decline for the last several years of his presidency. People are now coming forward to document that. We need to have some better laws, and to age out of. I don't know if you have to have an age limit on the presidency and members of Congress, but it's something that we should all be addressing very seriously, and then should be debated at. We should have a national debate about this, because do we value the presidency, do we want it to be just run by committee? That's the question.
So, Susan, as we wind up here, I know, having just written my book, there's a million things that you want to write about, and you can't fit them all in one book, or else, we would become Robert Caro writing the fifth book and the sixth book and the seventh book when it was going to be one book. So, was there anything in your research that you did for this book that you didn't really get to write about it as much as you wanted to? And as one of my favorite professors from college told me when I published my book, okay, now you've written the first book, now you need to get to work on the second one. So what's the next book topic in your future now that you have the book bug?
Well, I think my family would love for me to take a hiatus, because it was every weekend. I wasn't spending time with my family, and I give a lot of kudos to my husband for being almost like a single dad, taking care of my daughter. So it would be nice. I need a little bit of a reprieve, but the homelessness issue in California was a hard nut to crack, because it's like a homeless industrial complex. All these nonprofits that are getting the billions of money that from our taxpayer dollars are going to, and now it's upwards of more than 30 billion that have just gone down this complete drain, and with no progress. I want to know who's benefiting from these nonprofits. We know from one entity, it was called Shangri-La. It got more than $100 million contract and blew the entire thing. It was part of this Operation Home Key, I guess. I think that was what he called it. Gavin Newsom was changing the motels to hotels across the state, and this company called Shangri-La was involved in doing that for many different motels, including one in my hometown. But they had a CFO, who was a 20-something CFO, who just basically spent the money on his Beverly Hills rent for a Beverly Hills mansion, a Bentley, a Ferrari, all kinds of jewelry for his girlfriend. He just blew the money. So I wanted to know, what is the vetting like in that system? Who determines the contracts is the housing department. What I found, just for a cursory look, is the lobbyists for Shangri-La worked for Lieutenant Governor, looked for Newsom, and worked as a senior official in the housing department. I understand now that former Assemblyman, now District Attorney, U.S. Attorney Bill Asaley is going to be investigating where that money went, and Trump just recently appointed him to the U.S. Attorney for Los Angeles area. And so I'm hoping that we're going to get a lot of information out of that. But certainly none of the big newspapers in California are doing their job when it comes to discovering where the money went, the rat hole that went, that we're throwing billions down. I mean, we kind of know on the bullet train that the lawyers are eating up a lot of that money from the environmental processes that they have to complete for every segment of that railway that's non-existent. But for this, people are definitely benefiting from the overhead on these nonprofits. So I like to do that. But I also, one of my other passions is the Secret Service and the assassination attempt against Donald Trump. I did a lot of breaking reporting on that, and I continue to get information about the Secret Service and the reforms that agency needs to ensure that we don't have another assassination attempt, another the failures that were on display at Butler and on that golf course in September of last year, where Donald Trump was nearly killed twice. So people are coming to me and saying that I should do a book on the Secret Service. As I said, that it requires a lot of time. I have a day job, as you do, Timothy, and it's I'm working. If I do so, it'll probably be on the Secret Service, and then I'll probably do maybe an update on this particular book, the Fool's Gold book, as Gavin Newsom prepares to run for president. We have a few years before that, but hopefully those two projects will take up a lot of time. So, but that's where my interests lie.
Well, Susan, thanks again for coming on the podcast and spending some time with us. We really appreciate it. It's been a great discussion. The one question we ask everyone and every interview with, first a little background. Our podcast is called Next Round due to PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing politics and policy over a great glass of California wine. When you're visiting the French Laundry in honor of Gavin Newsom, what wine, beer, cocktail, or other beverage are you enjoying celebrating the publication of your terrific book?
Well, I always have a Pinot Noir. That's what I usually drink. So I would probably be doing that. I don't have a favorite winery. I have my cousin actually works in the wine business in Napa, and so I usually let her choose which do the tasting for me and choose which wineries I would partake in. But that's my go-to if I'm going to have some wine.
Well, Susan, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Enjoyed the conversation.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.